I was relegated to a seat behind a massive pillar at my brother's wedding, one of those ostentatious, purely decorative columns you only find polluting the otherwise pristine landscape of ridiculously expensive country clubs. While everyone else enjoyed a postcard-perfect view of the ceremony, the bride radiating ethereal beauty under artfully arranged soft white lights, the groom standing ramrod straight and beaming, my parents sporting smiles so wide they looked like they'd personally ushered royalty into the world. I was stuck staring at the unyielding back of a pillar and the meticulously coiffed heads of three strangers. And yet, unbelievably, that wasn't the nadir of my humiliation. The truly jaw-dropping moment arrived when a retired Marine Corps general, none other than my former commanding officer, strolled in fashionably late. He spotted me, alone and essentially hidden, and stopped dead in his tracks, a look of utter disbelief etching itself onto his face. Then he bent down, his voice a low rumble meant for my ears alone, and said, "Just follow my lead and pretend you're my date." Later that evening, when he rose to speak, every single head in that impeccably dressed crowd swiveled in our direction, and my father's smile evaporated as if it had never existed. But I'm getting ahead of myself, aren't I? Let me rewind, take you back to the beginning. It was late June in Colorado, a summer in full, glorious bloom. The kind of dry, insistent heat that baked the very air, turning it into something akin to sun-warmed stone. The wedding venue itself was perched precariously on a hillside overlooking Denver, a luxury resort selected, as my mother so delicately phrased it, because my brother Mark had finally made something of himself. Mark, the golden boy. Mark, the Teflon son who could seemingly do no wrong. Mark, the heir apparent who was diligently carrying our family name into the future. That's how my father introduced him to anyone who'd lend an ear. And me? I was simply Elizabeth, the daughter who'd inexplicably run off to join the Marines, subsequently spending the better part of 2 decades bouncing from one military base to another, one deployment to the next, until my life ceased to fit neatly into the saccharine, picture-perfect family album my parents so proudly displayed at church potlucks. I arrived at the resort a full 2 hours before the ceremony was scheduled to begin. Old military habits die hard. I parked my rental car, meticulously straightened my simple navy dress in the rearview mirror, and desperately tried to convince myself that the swarm of butterflies currently staging a coup in my stomach wasn't actually happening. Weddings were supposed to be these heartwarming, sentimental reunions. For me, they were glaring reminders of distance, of the life choices my father never quite managed to stomach, of the undeniable fact that while I was busy serving my country, my family had quietly, efficiently moved on without me. As I cautiously approached the manicured front lawn where the ceremony would unfold, I caught tantalizing glimpses of impeccably dressed guests, the delicate clinking of champagne flutes, and a frantic photographer orchestrating a gaggle of bridesmaids clad in pale sage green dresses, instructing them to tilt their chins just a smidge more toward the majestic mountains. I thought, perhaps foolishly, that I could be of some assistance. I approached the wedding planner, a young woman armed with a clipboard and sporting a permanently strained smile that suggested she was perpetually one crisis away from a full-blown meltdown. "Oh, everything's perfectly handled," she chirped, her tone bordering on dismissive. "You can just relax and enjoy." Women like her never quite knew what to make of me. Broad shoulders, a ramrod-straight military posture ingrained from years of drill sergeants, and absolutely zero interest in vapid small talk about floral centerpieces. I simply nodded politely and stepped aside, feeling as out of place as a Humvee in a flower shop. I wandered aimlessly toward the seating area, my eyes scanning the rows of chairs for my name. The front rows were adorned with elegant plaques, reserved for parents, immediate family, and the ever-important VIP guests. It wasn't pride, I told myself, that fueled my hope of finding my name somewhere near rows 2 or 3. It was simple logic. I was, after all, the groom's sister, and even if Mark and I weren't exactly bosom buddies, family was family. Or so I desperately wanted to believe. My name, Elizabeth Carter, was eventually discovered in the very back row 12 to be exact, tucked away in the far left corner, strategically positioned behind the aforementioned pillar. I stared at the small, cream-colored card, the elegant script mocking me with its formality, the utterly unnecessary decorative leaf printed in shimmering gold foil. Someone had deliberately placed it there, half hidden behind the imposing marble column, like a forgotten afterthought. For a long, drawn-out moment, I simply held the card, feeling the crushing weight of years compressed into that tiny rectangle of card stock. It wasn't just the seed itself that stung. It was everything it represented. Growing up, I'd always been relegated to the fringes of conversations, of family photos, of expectations. My father firmly believed that sons built legacies, while daughters merely supported them. He wasn't intentionally cruel about it, mind you. He simply never questioned the inherent rightness of the idea. Mark was the shining future, the one who stayed close to home, diligently joined the family business, and married the kind of woman who seamlessly fit into my mother's meticulously crafted vision of success. And I was none of those things. I joined the Marine Corps at the tender age of 19, much to everyone's collective dismay. My father didn't speak to me for almost a year afterward, not out of overt anger, but out of a profound disappointment so quiet and heavy it felt like being slowly erased from existence. And somehow, sitting behind that damned pillar at my brother's wedding felt precisely like that old, suffocating silence returning, enveloping me in its familiar embrace. Guests trickled in, a steady stream of well-wishers. They took their designated seats, engaging in warm, boisterous conversation, leaning across aisles to exchange hugs and reminisce about shared memories. I sat alone, my hands folded neatly in my lap, listening to the subtle, yet unmistakable, hum of polite ignorance that accompanies being completely overlooked. Then, just as the opening strains of the ceremony music began to fill the air, I heard a familiar voice behind me. "Is that Captain Carter?" I turned, and there he was, Major General William Harland, retired, but still standing with the unwavering posture of a man whose spine had been forged from iron and mountain rock. He'd aged, undoubtedly. Gray hair now framed his face, and fine lines radiated outwards from the corners of his eyes, but he was instantly, undeniably recognizable. He'd commanded our task force during a particularly brutal deployment overseas. A man of unwavering integrity and a quiet, burning intensity. "General?" I whispered, almost too stunned to stand at attention. "Sir, what are you doing here?" He glanced down at my chair card, then at the obscuring pillar, then back at me, his expression slowly morphing into one of simmering disbelief. "They put you here?" I shrugged, attempting to play it off with a nonchalant air I certainly didn't feel. "It's fine, sir. I'm used to it." "No," he said, his voice firm. "It's not fine." He eased himself down into the empty chair beside me, the one no one else had bothered to claim, and kept his voice low enough that only I could hear. "Just follow my lead and pretend you're my date." Before I could even begin to process the full implications of his audacious statement, the wedding march commenced. Guests rose to their feet. The bride, radiant in her elegant gown, began her slow, deliberate walk down the aisle. People leaned forward, their faces alight with anticipation. Parents dabbed at their eyes with monogrammed handkerchiefs. And from my vantage point behind the pillar, I saw almost none of it. I only saw the general's strong, steady profile. And then, every so often, I caught his eye, and saw a look of quiet protectiveness, as if he understood, perhaps better than anyone else in that meticulously planned gathering, exactly what it meant to be relegated to the periphery. When the ceremony concluded and the guests began to file toward the reception hall, he touched my elbow lightly and said, "I'm not letting you disappear tonight." I didn't fully grasp the weight of those words then, but I would soon enough. The strange, insidious thing about becoming invisible is that it doesn't happen all at once, in one dramatic, defining moment. It creeps in slowly, insidiously, year by year, holiday by holiday, until one day you're standing at your own brother's wedding, realizing with a sickening thud that nobody, not your father, not your mother, not even your own brother, expects you to exist in the center of anything. You're merely a background character in a carefully staged family photograph, the anonymous person holding the camera while everyone else strikes a pose. That particular feeling didn't originate at the wedding, of course. It had been gestating for decades. I grew up in a quiet, unremarkable Colorado suburb, the kind with idyllic cul-de-sacs named after trees and neighbors who waved enthusiastically from across meticulously manicured lawns while mowing their grass. My father, Thomas Carter, coached Little League, religiously grilled steaks in the backyard every Sunday, and fervently believed almost religiously in traditional roles. Sons carried the sacred family legacy. Daughters were nice to have, I suppose. My brother Mark arrived 2 years before me and was immediately crowned the undisputed center of the universe. Big, soulful brown eyes, thick, perpetually windswept hair, and a natural, almost effortless athleticism. People used glowing adjectives like solid, dependable, and a good kid with boundless promise. Teachers adored him. Coaches showered him with praise. Girls lined up for the distinct honor of dating him. My father walked around with the proud, puff-chest posture of a man whose family legacy was all but guaranteed. Then I came along, quiet, observant, and cursed with a strong will that simply refused to align with my father's predetermined script. I wasn't a problem child, per se, just someone who stubbornly refused to play along, refused to pretend to be something I wasn't. I asked too many questions. I devoured books about far-flung places, dreaming of adventures beyond the manicured lawns of suburbia. I infinitely preferred running laps until my lungs burned to playing with dolls in a frilly pink dress. And I absolutely detested being told I shouldn't do something simply because you're a girl. My father simply didn't understand me. My mother politely, almost surgically, ignored me. Mark tolerated me, in the way an older brother tolerates a pesky younger sister. And if I'm being brutally honest with myself, that dynamic never really shifted, not even as we grew older. I vividly remember one particular 4th of July. Mark must have been around 16, practically a hometown celebrity after scoring the game-winning touchdown at the state semifinals. Neighbors crowded around him at our annual barbecue, peppering him with questions about college recruiters, potential scholarships, and his future prospects, shaking his hand with the fervent enthusiasm usually reserved for a future senator. Meanwhile, I had just finished a charity 5K race for veterans and proudly won first place in my age group. I returned home sweaty, exhausted, and clutching the small, rather underwhelming medal they'd handed out at the finish line. I eagerly showed it to my dad. "Look, Dad, first place." He barely glanced up from his sacred grill. "Good job, kiddo." Then, without missing a beat, he bellowed, "Hey Mark, why don't you tell everyone about that scholarship offer you got from CU?" And that was that. As the years relentlessly marched on, I learned to actively suppress any expectation of applause or recognition. Instead, I found validation, surprisingly enough, in the only place I ever felt truly seen for who I was, the United States Marine Corps. I enlisted at 19, against the strenuous objections of everyone in my immediate family. My mother cried buckets. My father retreated into a stoic silence that lasted for 3 excruciating days. And Mark simply asked, with genuine bewilderment, why I didn't want a normal life. But for the first time in my life, I felt like I genuinely belonged somewhere. In the Corps, merit mattered. Effort mattered. Loyalty, above all else, mattered. Nobody gave a damn who your father was or how many touchdowns your brother had scored. Still, every time I came home on leave, I felt the chasm between myself and my family growing wider, the silence more deafening. Conversations at the dinner table invariably revolved around Mark's latest promotions, his burgeoning real estate business, his picture-perfect engagement to a local kindergarten teacher, his shiny new truck. Whenever I attempted to contribute, mentioning deployments or grueling training cycles, the room would fall awkwardly, almost painfully silent. One particular Thanksgiving stands out in my memory, sharper and clearer than the rest. I'd flown home from Okinawa with a paltry 36 hours of leave. I brought my father a carefully folded American flag that had flown during a poignant ceremony held by my unit. I placed it reverently on the kitchen counter, naively thinking it might actually mean something to him. Dad picked it up, examined it with the detached curiosity one might reserve for a novelty item purchased from a museum gift shop, and said, "You really didn't have to bring me a pity flag, Liz. I'd honestly rather you just came home for good." He didn't intend to inflict pain, I know that now. But he did deeply. That seemingly innocuous moment crystallized something fundamental within me. I wasn't a legitimate part of my family's narrative. I was an offshoot, a footnote, a distant cousin who just happened to share a last name. So, when Mark announced he was getting married and mailed me a formal, embossed invitation, I felt overwhelmingly conflicted. I genuinely wanted to be there, to support him. But I simultaneously dreaded the prospect of actually being there, of enduring the inevitable feeling of alienation. I was, after all, his only sister. But when I tentatively asked if he needed any help with anything, the rehearsal dinner, running errands, calming his perpetually stressed-out fiancé's pre-wedding jitters, he said gently, "Everything's completely covered, Liz. Just show up, okay? And don't worry about bringing a date. It's really not a big deal." My designated role was simple. Appear, but under no circumstances should I take up any unnecessary space. That unspoken message echoed loudly when I returned home the day before the actual ceremony. My parents were hosting a small, intimate pre-wedding dinner for the immediate family and a handful of close friends. I walked in with a carefully selected bottle of wine and a genuine smile plastered on my face. But I might as well have been a delivery driver dropping off takeout. Mom fussed incessantly over place settings and napkin arrangements. Dad talked shop with Mark and Gregory, the groom-to-be. I hovered awkwardly near the periphery of the living room, eavesdropping on their boisterous laughter, feeling as invisible as a ghost. At one point, Gregory, a polite, soft-spoken man I'd only met twice, turned to Dad and asked, "So, Mr. Carter, what exactly is it that your daughter does these days?" Dad waved a dismissive hand vaguely in my general direction. "Oh, she used to be in the Marines. Now she does something with security, I think. Consulting, maybe? It's honestly hard to keep track." I was standing a mere 8 feet away from them. 8 feet. And yet, I was utterly invisible. Later that night, Mark casually asked if I'd seen the seating chart file attached to the wedding email chain. I hadn't, apparently having been deemed unworthy of such crucial information. He resented it without comment. I opened the PDF in my sparsely decorated guest bedroom and zoomed in on the ridiculously detailed diagram. Row 12, tucked discreetly behind the pillar. I stared at the screen for so long that the letters began to blur, swimming together in a dizzying vortex. My palms grew clammy with nervous sweat. A familiar, unwelcome tight feeling crawled up my throat, constricting my breathing. It wasn't merely the seat itself that bothered me, I realized. It was the underlying message, delivered with surgical precision. Asterisk, this wedding is reserved for important people. And you, my dear Elizabeth, are decidedly not one of them. I switched off the bedside lamp and lay awake for hours, staring blankly at the slowly rotating ceiling fan. I thought back to countless deployment nights, remembering how the darkness felt fundamentally different overseas, heavier, imbued with a tangible sense of responsibility and ever-present danger. That night, however, the darkness felt intensely personal, a suffocating blanket woven from years of quiet disappointment and unspoken resentments. Still, I stubbornly told myself that I would go. I would show up, put on a brave face, and play the part that had been so meticulously assigned to me. I'd sit where they told me to sit, smile politely, and clap enthusiastically during the appropriate moments, because that's precisely what the forgotten daughter does. I had no way of knowing then that everything was about to irrevocably change the moment a retired major general walked into that ceremony and actually recognized me. I certainly had no inkling that he would flatly refuse to let me simply disappear into the background. Sleep remained elusive in the hours leading up to the wedding. I couldn't shake the image of that damn seating chart. Row 12, far left, behind the pillar. Part of me clung desperately to the naive hope that it was all a simple oversight, a clerical error. But another, far more realistic part of me knew better. In families like mine, the seating chart wasn't just a simple diagram. It was a quiet, yet brutally effective, declaration of rank and social importance. And my rank apparently hadn't improved one iota since childhood. The morning sun eventually streamed through the paper-thin curtains of my designated guest room, warming the small, sterile space my mother had decorated with aggressively floral quilts and framed, saccharine quotes about the importance of gratitude. I stared blankly at the ceiling for what felt like an eternity, allowing the familiar ache in my chest to slowly, inevitably wake up with me. Then I forced myself out of bed, showered mechanically, and dressed in deliberately casual clothes for breakfast downstairs. My mother was already in full hostess mode, hovering anxiously over a steaming pot of coffee, meticulously arranging a platter of oversized muffins, talking loudly about the meticulously planned schedule for the day. She barely registered my presence until I reached for a mug. "Oh, Liz," she said, offering me a polite, practiced smile that never quite reached her eyes. "Good morning. There are eggs in the fridge if you want to make some. I didn't know when you'd be up." She delivered the line as if she hadn't heard me pacing restlessly half the night, my footsteps echoing through the otherwise silent house. Dad was already deeply engrossed in reading the morning newspaper at the kitchen table. His reading glasses perched precariously low on his nose. He offered me a curt nod, nothing more. Not warm, not cold, just a perfunctory acknowledgement of my existence. The same nod he'd offer a neighbor walking their dog past our driveway. I quietly sat down with my coffee, bracing myself for the inevitable wave of polite indifference. They chatted amiably about timelines, guest lists, Mark's golf buddies, the weather forecast, the predictably heavy traffic, everything except me. I didn't expect anything more, of course. I simply listened, as I always did, a ghost at someone else's family breakfast. When I finally slipped on my shoes to head to the resort early, desperate to escape the suffocating atmosphere of forced cheerfulness, Mom called out, "Don't forget that it's a formal ceremony, Liz. Try to, well, just look presentable for the photographs, dear." Years of rigorous training in the Marine Corps had instilled in me an unwavering sense of discipline, unparalleled endurance, and remarkable resilience. But nothing, absolutely nothing, had adequately prepared me for the sting of a seemingly innocuous sentence like that. I forced a tight, unnatural smile. "I'll manage." The drive to the sprawling wedding venue took approximately 40 minutes. Winding through picturesque pine-lined roads and past breathtaking mountain vistas, so beautiful they almost physically hurt. Colorado was always like that, I reflected bitterly. Majestic, indifferent, stubbornly unchanged, no matter how drastically a person changed on the inside. I had driven roads just like these countless times before, when I shipped out for arduous deployments, when I came home on precious leave, when I attended somber funerals for friends who hadn't made it back. Now, I was driving the same damn roads to sit behind a pillar at my own brother's wedding, feeling as insignificant as a speck of dust. Life has a cruel, often inexplicable, sense of humor sometimes. The resort itself was stunning in that polished, understated way that wealthy people seem to adore. Meticulously manicured lawns that looked as if they'd been hand-trimmed with surgical precision, imposing stone archways, and ubiquitous white flowers artfully arranged just so. I parked in the designated guest lot and grabbed the garment bag containing my navy dress from the back seat. I'd deliberately chosen something simple yet elegant, not too flashy, not too plain. Middle ground. That's where daughters like me were expected to belong. Inside the opulent lobby, a cheerful attendant, whose smile seemed almost surgically attached to her face, directed me toward the bridal suite area. "If you'd like to say hello to the bride," she chirped, her tone bright and relentlessly optimistic. Her perfectly made-up eyes flicked over me, as if she were desperately trying to match a name to an unfamiliar face. She couldn't, of course. When I reached the bridal suite, the door was propped invitingly open. A cacophony of laughter spilled out, high-pitched, bright, and seemingly effortless. Bridesmaids in matching silk robes darted around the extravagantly decorated room, frantically curling hair, meticulously adjusting makeup, and casually sipping champagne as if it were ordinary tap water. They looked like they'd been plucked straight from a glossy magazine advertisement for joy itself. Victoria, my soon-to-be sister-in-law, sat regally in a makeup chair, positively glowing under the strategically positioned perfect lighting. Her perfectly styled blonde hair was pinned up in an elaborate updo, and the makeup artist hovered around her like she was working on a Hollywood movie star. Victoria's entire life was meticulously curated, flawlessly manicured, and relentlessly photographed, and everything about her fit seamlessly into my family's long-cherished ideal of success. I tapped lightly on the doorframe, hesitant to intrude on their carefully constructed world. "Morning," I said, stepping cautiously inside. Victoria glanced at me through the reflection in the mirror, her expression carefully neutral. "Oh, Elizabeth, you're early." She sounded vaguely surprised, I thought. Not necessarily pleased to see me, but certainly not displeased either. Just surprised. Like finding a mismatched fork in an otherwise perfectly organized silverware drawer. "I just thought I'd see if you needed any help with anything," I offered, my voice betraying a hint of nervousness. Her smile was polite, but unmistakably dismissive. "The planner has everything completely covered, but thank you for thinking of me." A bridesmaid I didn't recognize whispered something into the ear of another, and both of them glanced in my direction, offering sympathetic half-smiles that felt suspiciously like pity. I backed away with a small, almost imperceptible nod. "Okay then, I'll just go find my seat." I didn't belong in that room, I realized with a familiar pang of sadness. I never had and probably never would. I changed into my dress in a quiet, sparsely decorated hallway bathroom, smoothing the fabric meticulously and checking my hair in the mirror. I looked fine, I thought, more than fine actually. For a fleeting moment, I found myself wondering what it would be like to confidently walk back into that bridal suite, welcomed, wanted, an integral part of their celebration. But even just imagining it felt like trying to squeeze myself into someone else's ill-fitting uniform, beautiful perhaps, but ultimately not mine. Outside, near the meticulously arranged ceremony setup, the event crew was still diligently perfecting every last detail, meticulously adjusting the chairs, testing the sensitive microphones, and painstakingly straightening the elaborate floral arches. I clutched the small name card with my assigned seat number tightly between my fingers as I slowly approached the rows of chairs. I desperately hoped that maybe, just maybe, someone had noticed the egregious mistake and quietly updated it. Maybe one of the sympathetic bridesmaids had mentioned something to the wedding planner. Maybe, just maybe, my mother had taken pity on me and said something to someone. But the card matched the small sign posted at the end of the row. Row 12, far left corner, strategically positioned behind the damned pillar. I stood there, staring at that spot for a long, agonizing moment, the blood pounding in my ears. The gentle breeze carried the delicate scent of roses and freshly cut mountain air. Somewhere behind me, a child laughed, a sound both innocent and achingly poignant. Somewhere ahead, the string quartet was warming up, their instruments emitting a series of melancholic sounds. And I just stood there, clutching my name card, feeling the quiet, familiar ache slowly spread throughout my entire being. It would have been incredibly easy to simply leave, to just turn around, walk back to my rental car, drive back to Denver, and spend the entire day holed up in some greasy diner, eating waffles and pretending that weddings didn't actually exist. But I stayed because some stubborn, battle-hardened part of me, a part forged by years of relentless training and unwavering dedication in the Marine Corps, flatly refused to allow my own family to completely write me out of their carefully constructed narrative. So, I sat down behind the pillar, drawing myself up to my full height, my back as straight and unyielding as a steel rod, my chin held high, just the way the Corps had diligently trained me. It didn't matter that I couldn't actually see the aisle. It didn't matter that nobody seemed to notice my presence. I was there. I was present. Invisible or not. Guests began arriving in waves, a seemingly endless stream of family, friends, co-workers, and distant relatives who had traveled from all corners of the country. They filled the rows, happily snapping selfies, greeting each other warmly, and engaging in animated conversations. I remained stubbornly tucked away behind the obscuring pillar, completely unnoticed, until the precise moment a late-arriving man paused hesitantly at the end of my row. His impeccably polished shoes stopped just near my feet. Then, a deeply familiar voice said, "Captain Carter, is that you?" And in that single, fleeting instant, the world seemed to shift on its axis, transporting me back to a dusty, unforgiving forward operating base in Helmand Province. I could almost smell the pungent odor of diesel fuel, taste the metallic tang of adrenaline on my tongue, hear the distant rumble of approaching helicopters. Because standing there, in a sharply pressed civilian suit, his hair significantly grayer than I remembered, but his posture still as straight and unyielding as a rifle barrel, was Major General William Harlan. General Harlan, I whispered, half disbelieving. Sir, what in the world are you doing here? He gave me that same steady, assessing look I'd seen countless times in briefing tents overseas, the one that meant he was taking stock of the situation, calculating the angles and formulating a plan of action. I should be asking you the very same question, Captain. His eyes flicked pointedly to my strategically positioned seat, then to the obscuring pillar, then to the fact that nobody in the surrounding rows had even bothered to offer more than a perfunctory hello as he passed. His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, a subtle motion, but instantly unmistakable. I had seen that look before, the one he wore when young Marines weren't being treated with the respect they deserved, when something was clearly out of order. He sat down beside me, pointedly ignoring the numerous empty seats closer to the aisle. You know, Captain, he said, his voice low and resonant. In my rather extensive experience, seating arrangements tend to say more about a family than any carefully crafted speech ever could. I let out a breath that was half nervous laugh, half weary sigh. It's fine, sir. Really? No, Elizabeth, it's most definitely not fine, he said firmly. And don't sir me today. I'm officially retired, remember? Call me William. I really can't call you William, General, I said automatically, my ingrained military deference kicking in. He actually grinned, a rare and surprisingly disarming sight. Then call me General, and thoroughly embarrass me in front of all these civilians. Your choice, Captain. For the first time that entire day, I actually smiled, a genuine, unforced smile that reached all the way to my soul. The ceremony began. The music swelled, filling the air with its poignant melody. Guests rose respectfully to their feet, their heads turning expectantly toward the approaching bride. But from my decidedly limited vantage point, I saw only fleeting slivers of movement between shoulders and carefully arranged floral arrangements. A vague blur of pale fabric, the ethereal shimmer of the bride's dress, the back of Mark's impeccably groomed head. Faint snatches of soft laughter drifted my way, but I couldn't quite make out what was being said. General Harlan leaned slightly to the side, attempting to see around the imposing pillar, then shot me a look of incredulous disbelief. You're missing everything, Elizabeth. I know, General, but at this point in my life I'm sadly accustomed to missing things. The words slipped out before I could consciously pull them back, betraying the years of carefully concealed hurt and quiet resignation. He caught them instantly, his eyes sharp and knowing. Your seat wasn't an accident, was it, Elizabeth? No, General, I agreed quietly. It most definitely wasn't. We remained silent for a moment as the carefully rehearsed vows were exchanged somewhere beyond the pillar. The string quartet played a gentle, almost mournful melody. People sniffled quietly into delicate lace tissues. Someone's cell phone buzzed loudly, shattering the carefully constructed illusion of idyllic perfection. Sunlight warmed the tops of our heads, a small, unexpected blessing. Then, finally, the ceremony ended, a wave of enthusiastic applause rippling through the assembled crowd. Guests stood to migrate toward the cocktail hour, their conversations already turning toward the reception and the impending open bar. The general rose gracefully to his feet and extended a hand to help me up, as if I were still one of his trusted officers under his direct command. You're coming with me, Elizabeth, he said, his voice leaving no room for argument. I blinked, momentarily stunned by his audacious declaration. Sir, with all due respect, he sighed theatrically. Elizabeth, please humor an old, retired man. He used my first name, I realized, a familiarity he had scrupulously avoided during all our years together in the Marine Corps. I can't bear to watch you fade into the woodwork here. Before I could formulate a coherent protest, he casually took my elbow, his touch surprisingly gentle and respectful, and guided me purposefully toward the grand reception hall. People glanced in our direction, their eyes widening noticeably as they recognized him. Major General William Harlan possessed a reputation that stretched far beyond the confines of the Marine Corps. He was the kind of leader that Marines talked about in hushed tones for decades, the kind of man that even civilians instinctively respected. Inside the cavernous ballroom, impeccably dressed servers whisked past, carrying trays laden with sparkling drinks and delectable hors d'oeuvres. Soft jazz music drifted lazily from a small stage set up in the corner of the room. Guests clustered in small, chattering groups, admiring the elegant decor and the elaborate floral arrangements. The first thing I instinctively noticed was the meticulously planned seating layout, a U-shaped formation with the head table prominently displayed on a slightly raised platform. "Let's go find your seat, Elizabeth," the general said, his tone deceptively mild. But there was nothing mild about the determined set of his broad shoulders or the unwavering glint in his steely blue eyes. We approached the far side of the room, the outskirts, where the people who had been invited more out of obligation than genuine affection tended to be strategically placed. I scanned the table numbers until I finally located mine. Same damn deal as outside. Last table, farthest corner, the one located closest to the emergency exit and the perpetually crowded restrooms. "This is where they've put you, Elizabeth?" he asked, his voice dangerously low. I simply nodded, unable to muster a verbal response. "And me?" He scanned the meticulously printed seating list posted near the table. "Ah, table 11. Also back here near the emergency exit, I see." He huffed a short, humorless laugh. "Well, that certainly explains a great many things, doesn't it?" Then, without so much as a word of warning, he deftly plucked both our name cards off the table, folded them cleanly in half, and tucked them into his inner jacket pocket, as if they were pieces of incriminating evidence. "General," I whispered urgently, glancing around nervously, "we can't just do that." "Yes, Elizabeth, we most certainly can." He spoke with the calm, unwavering certainty of a man who had once confidently ordered in close air support during a blinding sandstorm. "Now, just follow my lead and pretend that you're my date for the evening." My eyes widened in stunned disbelief. "Your date, General?" He winked, a mischievous glint sparking in his eyes. "That's right, Captain. Tonight, you're going to help me make some very important people feel extremely uncomfortable." And with that, he confidently strode straight toward the front of the ballroom, toward the tables filled with prominent business leaders, influential politicians, well-connected extended family members, and people who clearly expected to be seen and admired. Conversations seemed to hush almost imperceptibly as he approached, the way they always had whenever he entered a room. The ballroom held a somber formality, each guest a note in a monochromatic symphony. Even in civilian clothes, General Harland projected an undeniable aura of command. He led me to table 3, strategically positioned near the head table, and with a subtle flourish pulled out my chair. "Reserved, General, only until we're seated," he announced, a mischievous glint in his eye. He then settled into his own chair beside me. Reserved no longer. Every eye in the room seemed to pivot towards us as I carefully lowered myself into the seat. A man from the adjacent table, practically vibrating with excitement, leaned over to grasp the general's hand. "General Harland, what an incredible honor." "Pleasure," the general replied, his voice warm and resonant. "I'm here with my date, Captain Elizabeth Carter." Another guest chimed in, curiosity piqued. "Were you two in service together?" Without missing a beat, the general's gaze softened with respect. "She served under my command. Finest officer I ever had the privilege to lead." A wave of heat rushed to my face. I instinctively sought refuge behind my water glass, but the general's steady hand gently landed on my shoulder. It was a reassuring gesture, a quiet reminder that I wasn't alone, that I was seen by at least one person in this room. Out of the corner of my eye, I caught my father's gaze from the head table. His expression was a complex tapestry of emotions: confusion, surprise, and a distinct undercurrent of displeasure. The tight lines etched on his forehead betrayed his inner turmoil. For once, he was out of the loop. For once, the script wasn't his to write. Dinner service commenced shortly after, an elaborate affair of plated salads, warm rolls, and hushed conversations. However, more than a few guests found reasons to approach our table, offering their compliments to the general and extending a handshake. And each time, without fail, he introduced me first. Not as Mark's sister, not as the daughter who used to be in the Marines, but as Captain Carter, one of his officers. With each introduction, the lines of my father's face seemed to tighten further. As the speeches began, best man, maid of honor, groom, the room's attention shifted towards the front. Everyone, that is, except the general. He leaned in close, his voice a low murmur. When their turn comes, I intend to say a few words. General, please don't, I pleaded, a knot forming in my stomach, but he simply gave me that look. The one that seasoned officers knew better than to argue with. Family should know when they've misjudged someone, he said softly, his eyes holding a wealth of unspoken meaning. Especially someone who served. My heartbeat quickened, echoing in my ears. And tonight, he added with an almost mischievous glint, they're going to know exactly who you are. The maid of honor concluded her speech to polite applause, and the band launched into a soft interlude as guests sipped champagne. The evening lights dimmed, casting the ballroom in a warm, golden glow, transforming it into a scene lifted straight from a magazine. Warm, elegant shadows danced across the room, each detail meticulously curated for the perfect photograph. I desperately tried to focus on the sparkling centerpieces, the effervescence of the champagne, even the aroma of the roasted salmon wafting from the kitchen, anything to distract from the growing unease churning in my stomach. I knew, with a certainty that settled heavy in my bones, that General Harland was about to do something I couldn't control. And for a woman who had spent years operating under the rigid structure of military protocol, relinquishing control was the most unsettling feeling imaginable. My father, meanwhile, sat back in his chair at the head table, exuding an air of self-satisfaction. My mother, equally stiff, smiled too broadly at anyone who glanced her way, radiating pride in her role as mother of the groom and in her prestigious seat of honor. Neither of them so much as glanced in my direction. Then, with a deliberate, almost ritualistic motion, General Harland placed his napkin neatly on the table. It was a small gesture, a quiet act, but I recognized it instantly. It was his pre-mission signal. A silent alarm went off within me. Brace yourself. He rose effortlessly, calmly, his posture ramrod straight. It was the same way he used to stand before addressing a platoon of Marines, commanding a respect that bordered on reverence. Conversations around us faded, then ceased altogether, as if the room itself recognized authority before the conscious mind could catch up. A spotlight from the ceiling caught the silver in his hair, turning it into a halo. "General, would you like the microphone?" a startled server asked, hovering nearby. He smiled politely. "That won't be necessary." Oh God. I gripped my water glass so tightly I thought it might shatter. He cleared his throat once, the sound echoing through the sudden silence. Even the band stopped playing. He began, his voice steady and clear. "Good evening. I apologize for speaking out of turn. I know weddings have their own carefully orchestrated order." A ripple of nervous laughter moved through the guests. They adored him already. My father's smile remained fixed, but his eyes narrowed, betraying his unease. He clearly had not factored this unscheduled address into his carefully laid plans. The general continued, his voice resonating with sincerity. "I'm William Harland. Some of you know me, some of you don't, but I had the honor of serving in the United States Marine Corps for over 35 years. A spontaneous burst of applause erupted. A few men even stood, saluting him instinctively. The general simply nodded, a gesture of humble acknowledgement. "And tonight," he continued, "I'd like to acknowledge someone I served with, someone I had the distinct privilege of commanding overseas, someone who demonstrated courage, loyalty, intelligence, and honor in ways most people will never witness firsthand." My pulse hammered against my ribs, each beat a deafening drum. Captain Elizabeth Carter. Dozens upon dozens of heads swiveled in my direction. My father's smile vanished as if wiped clean from his face. My mother nearly dropped her champagne flute, her eyes wide with shock. Mark, seated at the head table, blinked rapidly, as if struggling to process what he had just heard. General Harland continued, his voice as solid and unwavering as bedrock. She was one of the finest officers under my command. She led her Marines with quiet strength, made decisions under fire that saved lives, and carried burdens most families will never know. His eyes met mine, and I felt a hot sting behind my eyelids. Captain Carter didn't ask me to say this, he added, a hint of amusement in his voice. In fact, she may never forgive me for it. A chuckle rippled through the guests, but beneath the surface was a current of genuine emotion. She's far too modest for her own good and far too accustomed to standing in the back of rooms where she deserves a place in the front. My breath caught in my throat. Someone near the front row whispered, "Is that Mark's sister?" General Harland raised his voice, not louder, just firmer, enough to reach every corner of the room. Tonight, I had the distinct displeasure of discovering that Captain Carter, a decorated Marine veteran and as fine a person as you'll ever meet, was seated behind a pillar. A collective gasp swept through the tables, a wave of disbelief and indignation. My father stiffened, his face betraying the guilt of a man caught in a lie. My mother's hand flew to her throat, her composure visibly cracking. "She couldn't see the ceremony?" the general said plainly, his gaze unwavering. Not because the chairs were full, not because space was limited, but because someone decided she didn't belong in the front. Silence fell, heavy and brittle, threatening to shatter the carefully constructed facade of the evening. "I've seen a lot of things in my years," he said, his voice low and resonant. "But I have never once tolerated disrespect towards a Marine, and I won't start today." He shifted slightly, his hand resting lightly on my shoulder, a gesture of solidarity and support. "Elizabeth deserves better from all of us, from the world, and certainly from her own family." My chest tightened, a complex blend of gratitude, embarrassment, and pain. He finished softly, his voice devoid of anger or vengeance, just heartbreakingly sincere. "So tonight, let this be said plainly. Captain Carter has served her country with distinction, and I am proud beyond words to stand beside her as a friend." Then he raised his glass, his gaze fixed on mine. "To Elizabeth." A forest of glasses rose in response. People stood, offering a silent salute. Applause erupted, shaking the very foundations of the room. I sat frozen, overwhelmed by the torrent of emotions crashing over me. I had spent most of my life feeling invisible within my own family, and in a mere 30 seconds he had made me seen. As the applause began to subside, the general leaned down and whispered, "They needed to hear it." I swallowed hard, struggling to find my voice. "Sir, I don't know what to say." "Then say nothing," he said, his eyes softening with a warm, understanding smile. "Just hold your head high, Captain." And strangely, I did. When I finally dared to look, my father was staring at me. Not with anger, not with confusion, but with something else entirely, something I hadn't witnessed in years. Recognition. Uneasy, unearned, but undeniably real. Dinner resumed, but nothing was the same. Strangers approached me, offering their thanks for my service. Even the event photographer asked to capture a photograph of me and the general together. I wasn't invisible anymore. Not tonight, not in that room. But the real confrontation, the one I had spent years subconsciously avoiding, was still looming on the horizon. I could feel it, like the rumble of distant thunder, growing closer with each passing moment. My father was going to speak to me. For better or worse, things were about to shift, and I wasn't at all certain whether I was ready for the seismic upheaval to come. The applause from the general's impromptu speech was still fading as the dinner plates were cleared, and the band transitioned into a slow, nostalgic tune, something from the 70s that prompted the older guests to sway automatically in their seats. The lights warmed, encouraging people to mingle and converse, but nothing felt normal. Not for me, not for my family, and certainly not for my father. I sensed him before I saw him, an instinct honed from years of childhood observation. The almost imperceptible shift in the air, the subtle hush of nearby voices, the familiar tightening in my stomach. Dad had always carried himself with a peculiar stiffness in his shoulders, as if burdened by an invisible weight he refused to acknowledge. And now he approached our table with that same deliberate, unyielding gait. General Harland noticed his approach even before I did, his posture straightening slightly, not in a confrontational way, but with a quiet attentiveness. Ready? My father stopped at our table, for the first time all evening. He looked at me, not through me, not past me, but directly at me. Elizabeth, he said, the sound of my own name startling me. He rarely used it, opting instead for vague placeholders. Your sister? The girl? She? Her? As if uttering my name made things too complicated. Dad? I replied cautiously, bracing myself for whatever was to come. General Harland stood out of respect, a gesture born of habit and ingrained courtesy. Mr. Carter, he greeted formally. Dad nodded stiffly. General. A thick silence descended between them, heavy enough to carve through with a knife. Dad's voice, when he finally spoke, was quieter than I had anticipated. May I speak with my daughter alone? The general turned to me, not to Dad, subtly seeking my consent. It was a small gesture, almost imperceptible, but it sent a wave of warmth through my chest. Someone, finally, was treating me as the person in control of my own life. I'll be right over there, the general said, gesturing towards a nearby table. Just call if you need anything. His words held no overt threat, but they carried the unmistakable weight of unwavering loyalty. As the general stepped away, Dad pulled out the chair beside me and sat down. Not across from me where he could maintain a comfortable distance, but right beside me. That simple act alone made my heart skip a beat. He exhaled slowly, a sigh that seemed to carry years of unspoken words. I didn't know you served under him. I didn't think you'd care. I blurted out before I could stop myself. Dad flinched, not dramatically, but enough to cause my breath to hitch in my throat. My father never flinched. He was a man of rigid composure, stoic, quiet, and often cold, but he never broke character. Not for me. I cared, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. More than I showed. A bitter laugh threatened to bubble up, but I swallowed it down. You never asked. Not once. Not during deployments. Not when I came home. Not when I trailed off, unable to finish the sentence, turning my gaze away to steady myself. Not even when I was injured. He looked down at his hands, resting on the table, and I noticed the faint tremor in his fingers. Age, perhaps, or nerves, or something deeper, something more profound. I didn't know how, he admitted quietly, his voice raw with a vulnerability I had never witnessed before. Your choice to join the Marines scared me. That revelation stunned me into silence. My father scared, he continued, the words sounding foreign and awkward on his tongue. I didn't know how to support a daughter I didn't understand. You were strong, independent, determined. You didn't need me the way your brother did. That's not true, I murmured, my voice barely audible. He shook his head, his gaze fixed on his trembling hands. It is. And instead of saying I was proud, I pushed you away. I told myself it was because you didn't want my involvement. But that was a lie. I used it to protect myself from my own insecurities. I blinked hard, struggling to keep the tears at bay. Dad, I always wanted your approval. I just stopped expecting it. He swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing in his throat. I see that now. The weight of his words settled between us. Heavy, painful, but undeniably real. He glanced toward the head table, where the guests were chatting obliviously, lost in their own conversations. Your brother told the planner you didn't need a good seat. Said you'd want to sit quietly, that crowds weren't your thing. That's not what he meant? I said softly, a hint of defensiveness creeping into my voice. Dad sighed, the sound heavy with regret. No, it's not. He turned to face me fully, squaring his shoulders with a kind of steely resolve that I recognized all too well. I saw the seating chart yesterday. I didn't change it. I should have. It was the closest thing to an apology I had ever received from him. He leaned in closer, his voice barely above a whisper. But I saw you tonight. I saw how people reacted to you, how that general spoke about you. His eyes softened, a flicker of something akin to pride flickering within them. I didn't realize what you had become, who you had become, and that's on me. Tears pricked at my eyes, unwanted and uninvited, threatening to spill over. I didn't want a spectacle, Dad, I said, my voice thick with emotion. I know, he replied, his voice gentle. But it opened my eyes, and I needed them opened. We sat in silence for a long moment, the weight of unspoken words hanging heavy in the air between us. Then he reached for my hand, not tentatively, not reluctantly, but firmly, like a father finally overcoming years of hesitation. I'm proud of you, he said, his voice thick with emotion. More than you'll ever know. My breath shuddered in my chest, and I found myself unable to speak. He squeezed my hand again, his grip surprisingly strong. I want to fix things if you'll let me. I nodded slowly, tears finally escaping and tracing paths down my cheeks. I want that too. Relief washed across his face, momentarily erasing the lines of worry and regret. He looked almost human, so vulnerable, that it almost broke me. Good, he murmured, his voice barely audible. Good. Before he could say more, a timid voice interrupted us. Mr. Carter, they're ready for the parent dance. A young coordinator stood nearby, clutching a schedule clipboard, her expression apologetic. Dad shot me a hesitant smile. I'll talk to you after, he said, his eyes filled with a tentative hope. I'd like that, I replied softly, my voice choked with emotion. He rose from his chair, straightened his jacket, and walked toward the dance floor. He looked back once, just once, and in that fleeting moment, he didn't see a disappointment or an obligation. He saw his daughter. The band began to play a sentimental tune, a classic love song that tugged at the heartstrings. People gathered on the dance floor, couples swaying in each other's arms. My mother and brother waited patiently at the center of the floor. Dad joined them and the dance began. But even as he moved through the steps, his gaze kept drifting back to me. Small, furtive glances filled with something new. Regret, respect, recognition. The wound between us hadn't magically healed. But tonight the bleeding had stopped. And for the first time in years, I felt something inside me loosen, like a knot finally beginning to untangle itself. The night wasn't over. There were more revelations to come, more truths to face. But for now I allowed myself to breathe. Weddings always end the same way. Music fading, chairs scraping, people hugging goodbye with the lingering warmth of champagne still in their voices. But that night, as the final song played and guests drifted towards the exits, something felt profoundly different, softer, less bitter. As if the sharp edges of the day had been sanded down just enough for me to breathe without bracing for the inevitable blow. I stood near the French doors, looking out towards the dark lawn, catching my breath in the cool night air. Fairy lights twinkled along the railing, their reflections shimmering on the surface of the lake in gentle fragments. Behind me, guests chatted, laughed, gathered their coats, preparing to depart. Someone dropped a glass, shattering the momentary stillness. Someone else started singing an off-key ballad, a typical wedding ending, filled with its usual mix of joy and bittersweet sentiment. But I didn't feel normal. I felt like someone who had just witnessed a fault line shift beneath her family's foundation, and maybe, for once, that shift was in my favor. Mind if I join you? The general's voice broke through my reverie. He stepped beside me, his hands clasped behind his back, adopting the familiar stance of a man who would always be military, even out of uniform. You okay, Captain? He asked softly, his voice laced with genuine concern. I let out a slow, deliberate breath, feeling the cool night air fill my lungs. I don't know yet, I admitted honestly. He nodded, as if that were the most truthful answer in the world. Sometimes the biggest battles are fought without rifles, he observed, his voice filled with a quiet understanding. I huffed a quiet laugh, a wave of affection washing over me. You always did talk like a recruitment poster. Comes with age, he said dryly, a hint of amusement in his voice. And the arthritis. We stood together in comfortable silence, gazing out at the darkened lawn, each lost in our own thoughts. Thank you, I said finally, my voice thick with emotion. For everything tonight, for seeing me. His eyes softened, his gaze holding a depth of understanding. Elizabeth, I didn't do anything tonight that wasn't already true. Sometimes, people just need help remembering what they should have known all along. I swallowed the tightness in my throat, the weight of unspoken words heavy in the air between us. Still, I'm grateful, I managed to say, the words carrying the weight of years of unspoken emotions. He gave a small, almost imperceptible nod, as if he understood the profound significance behind those simple words. After a moment of silence, he cleared his throat, breaking the spell of the quiet night. Your father cares about you more than he knows how to show, he observed, his voice gentle. I'm not sure that's enough, I whispered, my voice barely audible above the gentle lapping of the water against the shore. Maybe not, he agreed, his gaze unwavering. But it's a start. We turned and walked back inside, drawn by the sounds of farewells and the clinking of glasses. Guests were gathering their belongings, preparing to depart. My mother floated from group to group, her movements almost hesitant, carefully avoiding my eyes, but wearing an expression I had never seen on her face before. Not irritation, not the practiced control she used to mask her stress. Something akin to uncertainty. It didn't feel like victory. It felt like truth finally catching up to her. Dad approached me slowly, his posture still softened around the edges from our earlier conversation, the raw vulnerability still lingering in his eyes. We're heading out, he said, his voice a little rough around the edges. I meant what I said, Elizabeth. I know, I replied, my voice soft. He hesitated for a moment, then pulled me into a hug. It was stiff at first, awkward and unfamiliar, then firmer, more resolute. Familiar, yet not familiar at all. When he finally let go, his eyes held something steady and promising, a glimmer of hope in their depths. I want to see you, he said, his voice earnest. Not just at events. Come by for dinner next week. My chest tightened, a mixture of apprehension and overwhelming relief washing over me. Yeah, I managed to say, my voice barely above a whisper. I'd like that. As they turned and walked towards the exit, he looked back at me once, just once, his gaze lingering for a moment. And in that moment, I knew he didn't see a disappointment or an obligation. He saw his daughter. The band began playing a final, sentimental tune, a slow waltz that seemed to tug at the heartstrings. As the music swelled, the last of the guests made their way towards the exits, their voices filled with the warmth of champagne and fond memories. But as I stood there, in the nearly empty ballroom, surrounded by the scent of extinguished candles and the echoes of laughter, I couldn't help but feel a sense of profound change. The fault line had shifted, and the world that lay before me was different from the one I had always known. I drove back to my hotel, the night fading into a blur of highway lights and exhausted adrenaline. I slept like a stone, deeper and more peacefully than I had in months. By morning, sunlight streamed through the curtains, painting the room in a warm, golden glow. Birds chirped merrily outside, their songs filling the air with a sense of renewed hope. I lay in bed, staring up at the ceiling, letting the strangeness of peace settle over me. Maybe things really had changed. Maybe I had changed. The months that followed moved slowly, carefully, like testing new legs, learning to walk again after a long period of numbness. Dad and I shared dinner the next week and the week after that. We didn't talk about everything, not all at once, but we talked about enough. About my deployments, about my injuries, about his fears, about the ways we had both misread each other for so many years. It was clumsy and awkward, but it was also healing and long overdue. Mom wasn't as quick to embrace the change. She remained polite, distant, quietly competitive, her movements still tinged with a hint of the old control. But she stopped pretending I wasn't there. Stopped acting as if my career was an embarrassment, something to be hidden away. Sometimes I realized that's all you can ask for. My brother apologized too, albeit awkwardly, his words carefully chosen. It wasn't personal, he stammered, avoiding my gaze. It felt personal, I answered, my voice flat. He swallowed hard, nodded, and admitted, yeah, maybe it was. We weren't suddenly best friends, sharing secrets and confidences, but we weren't strangers either. We were, perhaps, something akin to family. As for the general, he became an unexpected and integral part of my life in a way neither of us could have predicted. We met for coffee once a month, sometimes talking about the core, sharing stories and reminiscing about old comrades. But often, we talked about everything else. Life, love, loss, and the challenges of navigating a world that often seemed indifferent to the sacrifices of those who served. He never overstepped, never acted as if I needed protecting, but he was always there, a steady voice, a trusted mentor, a reminder of who I was when I doubted myself, when the weight of past experiences threatened to drag me down. Once, when I thanked him again for his speech at the wedding, for his unwavering support and his profound act of seeing me when no one else seemed to, he waved it off with that dry, familiar grin. Elizabeth, you earned every word. His unwavering belief in me didn't magically erase the absence I had felt from my family for so many years, but it helped teach me that value doesn't disappear just because someone else fails to see it. It exists independently, a truth that cannot be diminished by the ignorance or indifference of others. Years passed. My brother and his wife had a baby, then another, filling our family with the joyous chaos of childhood. I became Aunt Liz, the aunt who built elaborate forts out of blankets and pillows, who taught the kids how to pitch tents in the backyard, who snuck them extra cookies when their parents weren't looking. I wasn't relegated to sitting behind a pillar in their world. I was front and center, a valued and cherished member of the family. Dad seemed to age slower after we reconciled, as if a great weight had been lifted from his shoulders. Maybe the guilt and regret had been heavier than I realized, weighing him down all those years. Letting it go seemed to lighten everything about him. His shoulders, his voice, even his laugh. One afternoon, long after he and I had rebuilt what was broken, brick by painful brick, he said quietly, his voice filled with a quiet sorrow, I didn't know how to raise a warrior. You deserved better. And I realized then that sometimes, the parent you needed doesn't magically appear overnight. Sometimes they grow into the parent you finally get, evolving and learning and finally finding their way. The wedding became a family legend, whispered about, debated, retold in countless variations. Some people said the general had embarrassed everyone, creating an unnecessary scene and airing dirty laundry in public. Others said he had saved the day, finally giving Elizabeth the recognition she deserved and forcing the family to confront their own failings. Only he and I knew the truth. He didn't save my day. He saved my sense of worth. He gave my family something they could no longer ignore, the truth. And from that truth, everything else grew. If you're listening to this, maybe you've had moments of feeling overlooked, underestimated, or ignored. Maybe you've felt invisible in rooms where you should have belonged, your voice unheard, your contributions unacknowledged. Maybe your family didn't see you for who you were, or who you fought so hard to become, failing to appreciate the strength and resilience that lay within you. Here's what I learned, through years of pain and struggle and ultimately, a hard-won sense of self-acceptance. Sometimes the world won't acknowledge your worth until someone reminds them. Sometimes that someone is you, standing tall and refusing to be silenced. And sometimes, if you're incredibly lucky, it's a person who sees your strength long before you do, a champion who fights for you when you're too weary to fight for yourself. Forgive when you can, for holding on to anger only poisons yourself. Stand tall when you must, for your voice deserves to be heard. And never, ever, let a pillar block your view of your own value. Because the truth is, you are worthy, you are strong, and you are deserving of all the good things life has to offer. If this story resonated with you, If you found something in it that spoke to your own experiences, feel free to share your thoughts or listen to another story. And if you'd like more stories like this, stories about resilience, family, and second chances, I'd be honored if you subscribed.